The wind whispered softly across the hills of Israel, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant olive groves. It was a quiet night, but not a peaceful one. In these days, quietness was rarely the calm that people longed for. It was a silence born of fear. The land, promised long ago to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was no longer a place of rest. Midianite raiders, fierce and unrelenting, had swept through the valleys like a plague of locusts, stealing harvests, burning fields, and leaving behind little but ashes. Families had fled their homes and hidden in caves carved into the hillsides. At night, flickering lamps barely lit their hollow shelters, and whispered prayers filled the darkness. People asked why God had abandoned them, why he had allowed such suffering. Their fathers told stories of Moses, of the Red Sea parting, of manna falling from heaven, and of walls of Jericho crumbling at the sound of trumpets. But those were stories from long ago, and to many they felt like a distant dream. Among these weary souls was a man named Gideon. He was not a warrior nor a leader. He was just a son, one of many in a family struggling to survive. Gideon had never imagined himself standing before armies or wielding a sword in God's name. In truth, he thought of himself as the least among his kin, and his kin, the least among Israel. On this day, Gideon worked quietly at the winepress, but not to press grapes. He was threshing wheat, hunched low in the pit, his arms moving rhythmically, his heart pounding with each sound. From the distant hills, normally threshing grain was done out in the open, where the wind could carry away the chaff, but open fields meant danger. The Midianites had spies everywhere, ready to swoop down at the first sign of harvest. So Gideon worked in hiding, his breath slow and measured, his eyes flickering to the horizon, as if expecting to see a band of raiders appear at any moment. The sun hung low, bathing the land in golden light that stretched long shadows across the ground. Gideon's hands were rough, his tunic dusty, and his mind weighed down with thoughts of fear and frustration. He had heard of God's power, but where was that power now? Why did the Lord allow his people to suffer under the yoke of Midian? These thoughts swirled in his heart, a quiet storm of doubt, and yet, even in his doubt, Gideon was faithful in his work. His arms moved steadily, separating grain from chaff, gathering enough to feed his family another day. It was humble work, but in God's eyes, it was holy work. Every act of courage, no matter how small, echoed in heaven. The shadows deepened as evening fell. Crickets began to sing in the grass, their song mingling with the distant bleating of goats on a nearby hillside. Gideon straightened his back for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced upward, to the sky streaked with hues of orange and purple. Stars would soon emerge, the same stars Abraham had once gazed upon when God promised him descendants more numerous than grains of sand. Gideon wondered if that promise still stood. He did not know that tonight his life would change forever. A presence stirred near the oak tree at Ophrah, just beyond the winepress. Gideon did not notice at first. He was focused on gathering the last of the grain. But then a voice, calm and steady, broke the stillness. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon froze, his heart thundering in his chest. He turned, eyes wide, and there, seated beneath the oak, was a man he had never seen before. The man's clothing shimmered faintly in the fading light, as if woven from something more than earthly fabric. His gaze was kind, yet piercing, filled with a strength that seemed unshakable. Gideon's first instinct was fear. Mighty warrior? He looked around as if the stranger might be speaking to someone else. Surely not him. He was no warrior. He was a farmer, hiding from Midianites, not a leader ready to fight them. Gideon's voice trembled as he spoke. "Pardon me, my lord," he said softly, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The stranger's expression did not change. His gaze remained steady, as if Gideon's doubts could not shake the truth he carried. "Go in the strength you have," the man said, his voice low and full of authority. "Save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon's heart raced. "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes shining with a light that was not of this world. "I will be with you," he said, "and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The words hung in the air like a promise carved into stone. Gideon felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no ordinary man. Deep inside, a spark of faith flickered, though it was surrounded by fear and uncertainty. Gideon did not yet understand what was happening, but he knew this encounter was holy. As the evening deepened and stars began to pierce the sky, Gideon's life took its first step toward destiny. The stars blanketed the sky like 1,000 shimmering lanterns, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree where the stranger sat. Gideon stood frozen, his hands still clutching the bundle of wheat he had been threshing. The man's words echoed in his mind, heavy with an authority that stirred something deep within his soul. "I will be with you. You will strike down all the Midianites." But how could it be true? Gideon felt so small. His family was not known for wealth or power. He was no seasoned warrior. His hands were calloused from work, not war. The thought of saving Israel was overwhelming, yet the stranger's gaze carried a calm assurance that could not be denied. "Please." "Wait here," Gideon finally said, his voice steadying as courage flickered inside him. "Do not go until I return with an offering." The stranger nodded, his face serene. "I will wait," he said simply. Gideon hurried back to his home, his steps quick and silent through the darkened village. The night was still, save for the faint murmurs of families huddled in fear within their homes. The Midianites had stolen so much: grain, livestock, hope itself. Yet Gideon searched for what he could give. He selected a young goat from his family's small herd, the animal bleating softly in his arms. From the scarce flour they had managed to save, he prepared unleavened bread. He worked quickly, but reverently, his heart pounding at the thought of presenting an offering to this mysterious visitor. There was a weight in his spirit, a sense that he was not preparing a meal for a man, but for something far greater. When he returned to the oak, the stranger sat exactly as before, still and patient. Gideon placed the meat in a basket, the broth in a pot, and set it all before him. He bowed slightly, hands trembling. "Take the meat and the unleavened bread," the man said, "and place them on this rock. Pour the broth over them." Gideon obeyed, arranging the meal on the stone, the broth soaking the bread. The scent of roasted meat filled the air, but before Gideon could step back, the man reached out his staff and touched the rock. In an instant, fire leapt from the stone, blazing upward with a sudden roar. The offering vanished in a flash of flame, consumed completely. Gideon staggered backward, shielding his face, his heart pounding in awe and fear, and just as suddenly as the fire came, the man disappeared from sight. Gideon fell to his knees, trembling. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But a voice, gentle and reassuring, spoke to him in the stillness. "Peace, do not be afraid, you will not die." The words washed over Gideon like cool water over parched earth. His breath slowed, though his heart still thudded with awe. Slowly, reverently, Gideon rose and built an altar on that very spot, naming it "The Lord is Peace." The soft glow of starlight shone on the altar stones, marking the beginning of a journey that would change not only his life, but the destiny of his people. That night, as Gideon lay in his bed, sleep came in restless waves. His mind replayed every detail, the calm authority in the angel's voice, the fire springing from the rock, the certainty that God himself had chosen him. Yet alongside awe, there was fear. Could he really do what God had said? Could he lead his people, he who had spent his life hiding from their enemies? And then, before dawn broke, the Lord spoke to Gideon again. "Take your father's bull," the voice said, clear as a bell in the quiet night. "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Build a proper altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Offer the bull as a burnt offering, using the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down." Gideon's breath caught. His own father's altar. The people of his village, like so many in Israel, had turned from the God of their fathers and begun worshipping false idols. To destroy Baal's altar would be a declaration of war, not only against Midian but against his own neighbors. Yet the command was clear, and Gideon, though trembling, chose to obey. That night, Gideon gathered 10 of his servants. Under the cover of darkness, they crept silently through the village, careful not to wake anyone. The moon cast pale light over the altar of Baal, towering in the center of the square. The Asherah pole loomed beside it, a grim reminder of Israel's unfaithfulness. Gideon's hands shook as he lifted the axe. Every swing echoed in his chest like a drumbeat. The pole fell with a heavy crash. The altar of Baal crumbled, its stones scattering. Quickly, they built a new altar to the Lord atop the hill, arranging the stones with reverence. The smell of burning wood and sacrifice soon filled the air as Gideon offered the bull, just as God had commanded. When it was done, Gideon stood silently, heart pounding. The village still slept, unaware of what had just taken place. In the faint glow of the fire, Gideon saw the faces of his servants. They were afraid, but there was something else in their eyes too. Hope. Morning brought chaos. The villagers awoke to find Baal's altar destroyed, the Asherah pole cut down, and a new altar in its place. Shouts rang out as people searched for the one responsible. It didn't take long for someone to speak Gideon's name. "Bring out your son," they cried to Joash, Gideon's father. "He must die, for he has broken Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole." But Joash, standing firm, surprised them all. "Are you going to plead Baal's cause?" he said. "Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for Baal shall be put to death by morning. If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself because his altar has been broken down." The crowd fell silent. Joash's words rang true. If Baal was truly a god, he could defend his own altar. From that day forward, Gideon was given a new name, Jerubbaal, meaning "let Baal contend with him." Gideon's act of courage spread whispers through Israel. In a time of fear and oppression, one man had stood against false gods. But Midian's shadow still hung over the land, and their armies continued to gather. Gideon's heart was still uncertain, his courage flickering like a candle in the wind. He needed more assurance that God was truly calling him. And so, one evening, he prayed for a sign. "Lord," he whispered, spreading a fleece of wool on the threshing floor, "if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, then let the fleece be wet with dew in the morning, but let the ground around it be dry." Gideon lay awake most of the night, his thoughts spinning, his prayers soft but earnest. At dawn, he crept out to the threshing floor. His heart raced as he reached. For the fleece, it was soaked. Water dripped from the wool, yet the ground around it was dry as dust. Gideon wrung out a bowlful of water, his breath catching in awe. Yet even with this sign, fear still whispered in his heart. He prayed again, humbly, "Lord, please do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time let the fleece be dry and the ground covered with dew." The next morning, Gideon found exactly that, the ground wet with dew, but the fleece dry as if it had never seen moisture. There was no denying it now. God had spoken, and he had chosen Gideon. By now, the quiet man who once threshed wheat in fear was beginning to see himself differently. He was still humble, still trembling, but there was a new fire in his heart, a fire lit by God's own voice. And though Midian's armies loomed large in the valley, God's plan for deliverance was already in motion. The first light of dawn stretched across the hills like a soft veil, brushing the land in shades of rose and gold. But in Ophrah, Gideon's home, the beauty of morning was met with outrage. Word of what had happened overnight spread like wildfire. The altar of Baal, long a symbol of misplaced devotion, was gone. Its stones toppled, its sacrifices scattered like ashes in the wind. And the Asherah pole, towering high as a tree, had been cut down, its splintered remains lying in the dust. Villagers poured into the square, their faces twisted with anger and fear. To many, this altar was their safeguard, their way of seeking, blessing in troubled times. The Midianites were relentless. Perhaps they thought Baal's favor would keep them safe. Now, their supposed protection was in ruins. Voices rose like a storm. "Who has done this thing?" men demanded, fists clenched. Children clung to their mothers, sensing the tension in the air. Some villagers searched the hillsides for signs of the destruction, while others whispered suspicions. It didn't take long before Gideon's name was spoken. "Bring out your son," they shouted to Joash, Gideon's father. "He must die for this." Inside his family's house, Gideon heard the uproar outside. His heart pounded as he realized that his obedience to God had put his life in danger. He glanced at his father, uncertain of what would happen next. Joash was a man of strength, but like many in Israel, he had allowed idols into his home. Would he defend his son or hand him over to the mob? Joash rose to his feet and stepped outside, his voice calm but strong. "Will you plead Baal's cause?" he said, his words carrying over the crowd. "Will you save him? Whoever fights for Baal shall be put to death by morning. If Baal is truly a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken." "Down!" The crowd fell silent. Joash's words struck a chord deep in their hearts. If Baal was real, why should he need men to fight for him? Why should they fear a powerless idol? Murmurs spread among them, their anger beginning to fade into uncertainty. From that day forward, Gideon was no longer simply the quiet man who threshed wheat in hiding. He became Jerubbaal, a name that meant, "Let Baal contend with him." It was a title both of defiance and of faith. Gideon had stood against the false god of his people, and though danger still lurked, God had protected him. But Gideon's journey was only beginning. In the days that followed, whispers of Gideon's courage spread through the villages of Israel. In a time when most trembled before the Midianites, one man had dared to act. Yet Gideon himself felt the weight of what lay ahead. Destroying an altar was one thing, facing an army was another. The valley of Jezreel, wide and fertile, had become a staging ground for Midian's forces. The invaders poured in from the east like a swarm of locusts, their camels and tents covering the land as far as the eye could see. Alongside them came the Amalekites and other tribes from the desert. Together, they were a force too great for any one man or even a nation to overcome. Gideon stood on a ridge overlooking the valley one evening, the sky painted in hues of crimson and indigo as the sun set. The sight below was terrifying. Thousands of fires flickering in the distance, marking the encampment of Israel's enemies. His knees weakened as he imagined what would happen if Israel tried to fight them. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. "How can I do this? How can I lead your people? I am no warrior." But even in his fear, there was a glimmer of faith. The same God who had sent fire from a rock and silenced a murderous crowd had called him for this very purpose. Gideon returned home, his mind full of questions, but his heart stirring with determination. He lit a small lamp and spread out a sheepskin fleece on the ground, just as he had done before. He needed reassurance again, not because he doubted God's power, but because he doubted himself. "Lord," he prayed softly, his words carried like a whisper into the night, "if you will truly save Israel by my hand, as you promised, let this fleece be wet with dew tomorrow morning, while the ground around it remains dry." Gideon lay awake, listening to the distant howl of a wolf, the soft hum of crickets, and the faint rustle of the wind. He was a man caught between fear and faith, longing for a sign that God would not abandon him. At dawn, Gideon rose and hurried to the threshing floor. The fleece lay heavy with moisture, dew clinging to every strand. The earth around it was bone dry. His hands trembled as he wrung the fleece, filling a bowl with water. Yet even this miracle could not entirely still the tremor in his heart. He knelt again, bowing low. "Please, Lord," he whispered, "do not be angry with me. Let me ask one more time. This time let the fleece be dry and the ground be covered with dew." The next morning, the world awoke, washed in silver mist. Dew clung to the grass and trees, glistening like jewels in the early light. Gideon touched the fleece. It was dry. Not a single drop dampened his fingers, though the earth around him sparkled with moisture. This was no coincidence, no trick of nature. God was with him. For the first time, Gideon felt a steady confidence settle over him. The doubts in his heart were not gone, but they no longer ruled him. He knew now that this battle was not his to win by strength or strategy. It was the Lord's. He began to send word across Israel, calling for men to gather and fight. Trumpets sounded in the hills, and men from every tribe came to answer the call. Soon, an army began to form, a patchwork of farmers, shepherds, and blacksmiths united under one banner. Yet even as Gideon watched the men gather, he felt God's spirit stirring within him. This battle would not be like any other. God was about to show his people that salvation did not come from numbers or might, but from his own hand. The flickering torch of faith that had been kindled in Gideon's heart now burned brighter. The man who had once hidden in fear was becoming a leader chosen by God, but the true test of that faith was still to come. The night before the army was to march, Gideon walked alone among the hills, the stars bright overhead. He thought of the altar he had built, the fire that had consumed his offering, and the voice that had called him mighty warrior. Those memories gave him courage, but he also felt the heavy responsibility resting on his shoulders. "Lord," he murmured into the cool air, "I am yours. Do with me what you will. Just stay with me." And in that quiet prayer, under the ancient stars that had once shone on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Gideon felt the peace of God settle over him like a cloak. The God of his ancestors had chosen him, and nothing, not Midian's armies, nor the doubts in his own heart, could change that. The valley of Jezreel lay beneath the soft glow of twilight, its vast fields and rolling hills now covered with the tents of an invading army. The Midianites had come in numbers so great that no one could count them. Their camels alone seemed more numerous than the stars overhead, a sea of shadows that blanketed the land. Fear gripped the hearts of Israel's people, for Midian had ruled over them for 7 long years. Yet, for the first time in a generation, hope stirred among them, because God had called a man named Gideon to rise. Trumpets had sounded throughout the tribes, and men came from far and near to answer the call to arms. From Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, and Gideon's own tribe of Manasseh, warriors poured in, bringing with them swords, slings, and shields, though most were simple farmers with more courage than experience. Soon, Gideon stood on a hillside overlooking an army of 32,000 men. For a moment he felt a surge of pride and relief. At last, Israel was standing together, but then came the voice of the Lord. "You have too many men," God said, his voice calm and resolute, like a river. running deep beneath the earth. Gideon's heart skipped a beat. Too many? He glanced at the enemy camp, stretching endlessly across the valley floor. They were already outnumbered beyond comprehension. How could they have too many? If I deliver Midian into your hands with this number, God continued, Israel would boast against me and say, my own strength has saved me. Gideon closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He understood. This would not be a battle won by swords or numbers. It would be won by the power of the Almighty. Announce to the army, God said, that anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave. At dawn, Gideon stood before his gathered troops. The morning sun cast golden light over their faces, faces filled with courage, but also fear. Gideon's voice carried over the crowd, strong and steady, despite the pounding of his heart. Whoever among you is fearful, he called out, and whoever trembles at the thought of this battle, you may depart. Return to your homes in peace. Murmur ran through the ranks. Men exchanged glances. Some tightened their grips on their swords, unwilling to show weakness. But slowly, hesitantly at first, men began to step away. 10, 50, 100. The trickle became a steady stream, and soon Gideon watched as thousands of men turned and walked back toward their homes. When the count was finished, 22,000 had departed. Only 10,000 remained. Gideon stood silent for a moment, taking in the sight of his reduced army. Fear tried to whisper in his heart, but he silenced it with prayer. God had spoken and Gideon would trust him. But God was not finished. You still have too many men, the Lord said. Gideon blinked, stunned. Too many. 10,000 against an enemy as numerous as locusts. And yet the Lord said it was still too many. Take them down to the water, God instructed. There I will test them for you. I will tell you who shall go with you and who shall not. So Gideon led his remaining men to a nearby stream. The air was warm, and the sound of rushing water was a welcome relief. The men knelt eagerly to drink, some plunging their faces straight into the stream, cupping water with both hands. Others knelt but brought water to their mouths carefully, staying alert to their surroundings. The Lord spoke again, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel to drink. When the test was complete, only 300 men had drunk water by cupping it in their hands and staying vigilant. The rest had knelt and drunk without caution. Send the others home, God said. With the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. 300. Out of 32,000, only 300 would remain. He watched as the other men gathered their belongings and returned home, their hearts heavy yet trusting. Soon, the hillside was quiet again, and Gideon stood surrounded by just 300 warriors, men whose eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The camp of Midian still stretched endlessly below, a dark ocean of tents and fires flickering under the evening sky. The contrast was staggering, 300 against thousands beyond counting. Yet Gideon felt no despair. The voice of the Lord was clear. This was God's battle, not man's. That night, as the men prepared their few supplies, trumpets, jars, torches and swords, Gideon knelt in prayer. The air was cool and the stars shone brightly overhead. Lord, he whispered, I know you have spoken. I know you are with me, but my heart is still afraid. God, in his mercy, answered Gideon with a gentle invitation. Go down to the Midianite camp, the Lord said, and listen. If you are afraid to attack, take your servant Purah with you, and you will hear what they are saying. Afterward, you will be strengthened to go. Quietly, Gideon rose and beckoned to Purah. The two men moved like shadows through the night, descending the hill toward the enemy camp. The closer they came, the more overwhelming the sight became. The Midianites were everywhere, their camels tied in clusters, their soldiers resting by campfires. The low murmur of voices filled the night, like the distant hum of bees. Gideon and Purah crept closer, hiding among rocks, until they were near enough to hear the conversation of two Midianite soldiers. "I had a dream," one of the men was saying, his voice hushed. "I saw a round loaf of barley bread tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck a tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His companion leaned in. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite," he said. "God has given Midian and the whole camp into his hands." The words struck Gideon like a bolt of lightning. He had not spoken a word, yet even the enemy knew what God was about to do. The fear that had clung to him for so long melted away, replaced by awe and courage. He fell to his knees right there among the rocks and whispered a prayer of worship. "Sovereign Lord," he breathed, "you have spoken, you have promised, and you will deliver." With renewed strength, Gideon rose and returned to his camp. His heart burned with determination as he roused his 300 men. "Get up," he called softly but firmly. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." The men gathered around him, their faces lit by the glow of the campfires. Gideon's voice was calm but resolute as he divided them into 3 companies of 100 each. He handed each man a trumpet, a torch, and a clay jar to hide the light until the right moment. "There are no swords in your hands," he said, "but the sword of the Lord will fight for us. Do exactly as I do, and the Lord himself will bring us victory." The men nodded, their trust in their leader and their God shining in their eyes. As the night deepened, Gideon and his 300 warriors moved quietly into position around the Midianite camp. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the soft crunch of footsteps on the dry earth and the distant crackle of enemy fires. In the stillness, Gideon's heart was calm. He no longer doubted. The God who had called him mighty warrior had stripped away every crutch, numbers, strength, human strategy, so that all would see this victory belonged to the Lord. Soon the signal would come, and the valley would erupt, not with the clash of swords, but with a sound and a light that would shatter the enemy's courage. The moment of deliverance was near. The moon hung low over the valley, bathing the land in pale silver light. The Midianite camp stretched like an ocean of tents, fires flickering softly among them, shadows of soldiers moving lazily as they kept their watch. To the human eye, it was an impregnable force, too many warriors to count, too many camels, too many weapons. Yet somewhere on the hillside above, only 300 men stood poised, torches hidden within clay jars, trumpets in hand, hearts beating like drums in the stillness of the night. Gideon knelt behind a boulder, his fingers brushing the cool earth. He closed his eyes and breathed a prayer. "Lord, this is your battle. Let them see that you are God." He rose and looked into the faces of his men. Farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, now turned into warriors of faith. They stood silently, eyes gleaming with determination in the dim light. Gideon gave a simple nod. The time had come. He divided them into 3 companies of 100 each, spreading them around the edges of the Midianite camp. The valley was calm, the only sound the soft chirping of crickets and the faint crackle of firewood from the enemy's campfires. The cool night air carried the scent of smoke and dry grass. Gideon's heart was steady now. Fear no longer gripped him as it once had. Every step he took was guided by the same voice that had called him mighty warrior. He motioned for his men to ready themselves. Each held a torch concealed within a clay jar, a trumpet slung over. Their shoulder and no sword in their hand, Gideon whispered to the men nearest him, his voice low but resolute. "Watch me. Do what I do. When I blow my trumpet, you blow yours. Shout what I shout, and then you will see the hand of the Lord." The signal came suddenly. Gideon lifted his trumpet and blew with all his strength. The clear, piercing sound split the silence of the night, echoing off the hills like a cry of triumph. All at once his men followed suit, trumpets blaring in unison, a cacophony of sound that shattered the quiet calm of the Midianite camp. At that same moment, Gideon smashed the jar in, his hand revealing the blazing torch within. Across the hillside, 299 more torches burst into light, flames flickering wildly against the darkness. And then came the cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The shouts rolled like thunder through the valley, carried on the wind, magnified by the echoes of the hills. The Midianite camp erupted in chaos. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, disoriented by the sudden light and noise. Trumpets blared again and again. Torches blazed all around them, and the cry of Gideon's men filled the night air. To the Midianites, it seemed as though an army far greater than 300 surrounded them. Panic spread like wildfire. Men shouted orders, only to be drowned out by the deafening blast of trumpets. Camels reared and bolted in terror, trampling through tents. In the confusion, Midianite soldiers turned their swords on each other, mistaking friend for foe in the flickering light. The valley that had been calm moments before now roared with chaos. Gideon stood at the edge of the hillside, torch raised high, watching as the Lord himself fought the battle. The Israelites had not lifted a single sword, yet the enemy was already destroying itself. Flames from toppled torches cast long, dancing shadows across the camp, and screams of fear echoed through the night. The Midianites fled, scattering in every direction, their once mighty force reduced to a panicked mob. "Chase them!" Gideon commanded, his voice ringing out over the din. "The Lord has given them into our hands." His men surged forward, their courage ignited. They pursued the enemy, driving them from the valley, striking down those they could, and sending the rest fleeing toward the Jordan River. As Gideon ran with his men, his breath coming in steady bursts, he thought back to the man he had been only days ago, the man hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat in fear. Now here he was, leading 300 warriors in a battle that had already been won by the Lord before a single sword was drawn. This was no ordinary victory. It was a miracle. The pursuit continued through the night. Gideon's men captured 2 of Midian's commanders, Oreb and Zeb. Oreb was slain at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, places that would forever bear their names as reminders of God's power. But Gideon's task was not yet finished. Though Midian was in disarray, their kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, still lived, and their army, though broken, was not entirely destroyed. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Gideon gathered his exhausted men. They had been running and fighting all night, yet their spirits were high. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mingled with the scent of morning dew. "Men of Ephraim," Gideon called to the tribe nearest the Jordan, "cut them off at the river. Do not let them escape." The men of Ephraim answered the call, capturing the fords of the Jordan and striking down those who tried to cross. The heads of Oreb and Zeb were brought to Gideon as proof of God's deliverance. For the first time in 7 years, Israel tasted victory. The fields that had once been stripped bare by Midian's raids now stood as symbols of hope. The God of their fathers had not forgotten them. He had raised up a man who once trembled in fear and turned him into a leader who trusted wholly in his power. Yet Gideon knew this was not the end of the story. Zebah and Zalmunna were still alive, and as long as they breathed, Midian would remain a threat. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Gideon turned to his 300 weary warriors. Their faces were smudged with dirt, their eyes tired but burning with resolve. "Come," Gideon said softly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "We will finish what the Lord has begun." That night, the valley of Jezreel was silent once more. The fires of the Midianite camp had been extinguished, their army shattered and scattered. Stars twinkled overhead, serene and unbothered, as if they had been waiting all along for this moment when fear would no longer rule Israel. And there, under the starlit sky, Gideon knelt. He set his torch in the ground beside him and bowed his head, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Lord," he whispered. "You have done this. You have rescued your people." A gentle breeze rustled the grass around him, carrying with it the scent of victory, not the bitter smell of bloodshed, but the sweetness of freedom, faith restored, and hope reborn. The morning sun rose over the hills, casting its warm light on a land that only hours earlier had been filled with the chaos of battle. The Midianite camp lay in ruins, its tents abandoned, its warriors scattered like dry leaves in the wind. Yet Gideon stood tall among his 300 men, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Victory had been granted, but the work was not yet complete. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, had fled eastward with what remained of their army, 15,000 men, a shadow of the once countless host. If they were allowed to escape, they would return to terrorize Israel again. Gideon's jaw tightened with determination. The Lord had delivered them into his hands, and Gideon would not rest until the threat was gone. The men of Israel were exhausted. Their bodies ached from the long night of pursuit, and their feet were blistered from running over rocky ground. Yet, when Gideon called out, "We will not stop," not one man hesitated. They followed him without complaint, driven not by strength of body, but by faith in the God who had already shown his power. The army moved eastward, crossing through rugged terrain toward the Jordan River. The land was dry and unforgiving, the sun beating down on their weary shoulders. Dust rose with each step, coating their faces and hands. Still, they pressed on, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the fleeing kings. As they neared the city of Succoth, Gideon slowed his pace and approached its elders. The men of Succoth were Israelites, their city fortified with high walls and sturdy gates. Gideon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Please," he said, "give my men some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." The elders exchanged glances, their expressions wary. One of them, an older man with a grey beard, stepped forward and said, "Do you already have Zebah and Zalmunna in your hands, that we should give bread to your army?" Gideon's heart sank at their words. Instead of rallying behind their brothers, these men hesitated, fearing that aiding Gideon might bring Midian's wrath upon them if he failed. He met their gaze, his eyes steady. "Very well," he said. "When the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hands, I will return and tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." Without another word, Gideon turned away. They pressed, on hunger gnawing at their stomachs, fatigue weighing on their legs. Soon they reached the city of Penuel, another stronghold of their own people. Once more Gideon made his request, "Give us bread, for my men are exhausted, and I pursue the kings of Midian." But again the answer was the same, fear and refusal. Gideon's expression was calm, but his words were resolute. "When I return in peace, I will tear down this tower." The men of Penuel watched in silence as Gideon and his warriors turned and marched on, their determination unbroken. Beyond the cities of Succoth and Penuel, the land stretched out into wilderness. The sun beat down mercilessly as Gideon's 300 pursued the Midianite kings. Ahead of them, Zebah and Zalmunna felt secure, believing that their pursuers were too exhausted to catch them. But they had not reckoned with the resolve of men strengthened by faith. Gideon led his men in silence, every step purposeful. They came upon the camp of the Midianite kings at Karkor, where the remaining 15,000 warriors rested. The camp was unprepared, for the Midianites believed they had escaped. With quiet precision, Gideon divided his men and attacked. The strike was swift and decisive. Panic spread among the Midianites as the Israelites descended upon them like a storm. Gideon's warriors moved with the same faith-driven courage that had shattered the enemy at Jezreel. Though vastly outnumbered, they fought with the strength of men who knew the Lord fought beside them. The Midianite camp erupted in chaos once more. Soldiers fled in every direction, and Zebah and Zalmunna tried to escape, but Gideon's men pursued them relentlessly. The kings were captured, and the last remnants of Midian's power were broken. The Israelites gathered their prisoners, tying Zebah and Zalmunna with ropes. The once proud kings now stood in silence, their heads bowed. Gideon looked at them, his face calm but stern. These were the men who had oppressed Israel, who had plundered their land and killed their people. Now they stood defeated, their power stripped away. Gideon turned his army back toward the Jordan, leading his captives through the very cities that had refused to help him. When they reached Succoth, Gideon summoned the elders. They came reluctantly, their expressions uneasy. Gideon's voice was steady as he spoke. "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Do you already have them in your hands?'" The elders' faces paled. Gideon ordered his men to seize them, and he punished them with desert thorns and briars, just as he had promised. Then he moved on to Penuel. There, too, he called the men of the city and said, "I told you I would return and tear down this tower." With calm authority, Gideon commanded that the tower be destroyed, and the men who had opposed him were struck down. His actions were not born of cruelty, but of justice. The people of Succoth and Penuel had chosen fear over faith, and their betrayal had endangered their brothers. Gideon's punishment was a solemn reminder that God's call was not to be taken lightly. At last, Gideon stood before Zebah and Zalmunna. He questioned them, his voice low and steady. "Those men you killed at Tabor, what kind of men were they?" The kings looked at each other, then at Gideon. "They were like you," they said quietly. "Each one resembled the son of a king." Gideon's jaw tightened. "They were my brothers," he said, his voice trembling with restrained grief. "The sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not take yours." He turned to his eldest son, Jether, and said, "Kill them." But Jether was young, and fear filled his eyes. He could not raise his sword. Zebah and Zalmunna, seeing his hesitation, mocked him. "Rise yourself and strike us," they said, "for as the man is, so is his strength." Gideon stepped forward. In one swift motion he struck them down. Justice was done, and the land of Israel was free from Midian's terror. The 300 men stood in silence as the sun dipped low on the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and victory. They had fought not for riches or glory, but because God had called them, and he had been faithful. Gideon knelt once more, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He had seen God's power in ways he could never have imagined, turning fear into courage, weakness into strength, and 300 men into a force that toppled an empire. Israel was free. The land, for so long ravaged by Midianite raiders, would finally know peace. But Gideon knew that the true battle, the battle for the hearts of his people, was still to come. The days following Midian's defeat were unlike anything Israel had known in years. The valleys that had once echoed with the trampling of camels and the shouts of oppressors now lay quiet. The fields that had been stripped bare by raiders grew green again, and for the first time in a generation, Israel began to taste the sweetness of peace. Gideon, weary but resolute, returned home to Ophrah. Word of his victory spread quickly across the land. Men, women, and children greeted him with cheers, and elders from every tribe came forward, their faces alight with gratitude. "You have saved us," they said. "You have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Rule over us, you and your son, and your grandson after you, for you have led us to freedom." But Gideon, standing before the people, shook his head. His voice was calm but firm as he replied, "Will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." The crowd fell silent. Gideon's words were a reminder that their deliverance had not come from a man's strength, but from the hand of God himself. Though he refused a crown, Gideon asked for something else. "Each of you, give me an earring from your share of the plunder," he said. The people readily agreed, and soon a great heap of gold lay before him, taken from the spoils of Midian. Gideon used this gold to fashion an ephod, a sacred garment, a reminder of God's victory. But over time, what was meant as a symbol of devotion became a snare. The people of Israel, instead of seeking the Lord directly, began to revere the ephod, and their hearts slowly turned away from God once again. Even Gideon's own family was not untouched by the creeping shadow of idolatry. Though peace reigned during his lifetime, the seeds of spiritual compromise were being sown, seeds that would one day bring sorrow. Gideon grew old and lived many years in the land he had helped free. His household was large, his family spread throughout Israel, and for 40 years the nation enjoyed rest. Yet despite his faith and his victories, Gideon's story was also a warning. Even the strongest leaders are still human, and only God is truly worthy of worship. After Gideon died, Israel quickly turned back to the worship of false gods, forgetting the Lord who had rescued them, forgetting the miracles they had seen with their own eyes. They even forgot Gideon's house and all he had done for them. Still, Gideon's life stands as a testimony of God's power. He was not a king, not a warrior by birth, not a man who sought greatness. When God first called him, he was hiding in fear, threshing wheat in secret. Yet God saw in him something Gideon could not see in himself: courage, obedience, and a heart that could trust the impossible. It was not Gideon's sword that defeated Midian. It was not his numbers, his strategy, or his strength. It was God's presence, God's plan, and God's power. Gideon's story whispers to every heart that feels too small, too weak, or too afraid. God's strength is made perfect in weakness. As night settled over Israel, the stars shone bright and steady, the same stars Gideon had seen so many times during his journey. They stood as silent witnesses to all that God had done, how he had raised up an unlikely hero, broken the pride of an enemy, and brought peace to his people. For generations, parents would tell their children the story of Gideon, the man who led 300 warriors against an army beyond counting, the man who trusted God when the odds were impossible. And with each retelling, hearts would be stirred to faith again. Even now, thousands of years later, Gideon's story still speaks. It reminds us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to trust God in the midst of fear. It shows us that miracles often come through those who feel unworthy but are willing to obey. And it teaches us that lasting victory does not come from human strength, but from surrender to the one who is greater than any enemy. If you've ever felt small or overlooked, Gideon's story is for you. If you've faced battles that seemed impossible, his life is a reminder that God delights in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. And so, the story of Gideon comes to a close, not with the rise of a king or the building of an empire, but with a quiet peace. A peace hard won, not by the sword of man, but by the faithfulness of God. As the soft night winds move through the hills of Israel, the echoes of Gideon's battle cry fade into history, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Yet, even as the cry fades, its truth remains. God is our deliverer. He fights for his people. He calls us to trust him even when the odds are against us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more epic Bible narratives to fall asleep to, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring more inspiring, peaceful stories like this one. Click the bell so you won't miss the next journey through Scripture.